Hello, I'm Caroline. Welcome to my channel. Thank you for joining me for today's video, and I'll be reading from this book, The Facts About the Celts. I hope you find it interesting, and let's get started. Who were the Celts? The Celts lived in parts of Europe from the 8th century BC to the middle of the 1st century AD. They came from Halstatt in Austria. If you look at the map on page 9, you'll see how they moved from Halstatt to other parts of Europe. They travelled to northern Italy, Spain, France, and Britain. Metalworkers. Before the time of the Celts, bronze was the metal used in Europe for making tools and weapons. Then the Celts found a way to turn iron ore into metal. As there was lots of iron ore, they could make more metal tools, like this dagger and sheath. A statue of a Celt. There are many clues that tell us what the Celts look like. We can look at the pictures made on tools and weapons by Celtic craft workers. We can read about the Celts in books written by Normans. This statue of a Celt is in Rome. It celebrates one of the Roman victories over the Celts. The Celtic world. The Celts were good farmers who grew lots of food. As the number of Celts increased, they spread out across Europe. They were looking for more land to farm. Some Celts became mercenary soldiers in other countries' armies. The different groups of Celts were never ruled by one leader. There were separate tribes, like those shown on this map of Britain. Britain, Germans, Halstatt, La Tène, Pannonia, Gaul, Dacians, Thracians, Galatians, Sabines, Etruria, Magna Graecia, Celtiberia, Iberia. Halstatt and La Tène. There are two Celtic periods. The first is from 750 to 450 BC. It's called Halstatt, after the area where the Celts were first known. The second period is from 450 BC to AD 50. It's called La Tène after a settlement in Switzerland. This photograph shows La Tène is now under water. In Celtic times, it was on dry land. Did the Celts grow their own food? Most Celts were farmers. They used their iron axes to clear the forests, which covered large parts of Europe at that time. The land was then used for growing crops, such as rye, wheat, barley, and beans. The barley was used for making flour and also beer. Cattle were kept for meat and milk. Sheep were kept for meat as well as for their wool. The wool was spun into woven cloth. Celtic fields. Celtic fields were usually square or oblong. They could be ploughed in one day with a plough pulled by 2 oxen. This photograph shows a reconstruction of a Celtic farm in Hampshire, England. Farming tools. By 500 BC, Celtic farming tools were similar to the ones still being used at the start of the 20th century. The scythe, shown here, was fixed to a wooden handle and used to cut hay. The shears were used to clip wool from sheep in the summer. Storing grain. Grain that had been harvested was stored in pits. The pits were about 1.8 metres deep and lined with wicker or stone. Looking after stock. In Celtic times, wolves and bears still lived in most parts of Europe. Farmers fired iron-tipped arrows like these at wild animals that attacked their cattle and sheep. The Roman general Julius Caesar visited Britain in 55 BC. He found there were many farms and many cattle there. He said that the people who lived inland did not grow corn but lived on milk and meat instead. Hunting was important to the Celts. They usually hunted on horseback and used spears to kill the animals. This bronze model from Spain shows they hunted the wild boar that lived in the forests. Did the Celts have families like ours? We don't know much about the structure of early Celtic families. From later times in Ireland, we know that a family was made up of the 4 generations who all came from the same great-grandfather. The land belonged to the whole group. The head of the family was usually a male relative. This bronze head shows a Celtic man wearing a torque round his neck. The torque shows how important he was. It tells us that he was probably a warrior, as well as a farmer and the head of his family. A man was usually the head of the family, but it seems many women were treated as equals. In some noble families, women became rulers. Many of them were buried with their valuable jewellery. Children. This plaque shows a girl combing a goddess's hair. It's a rare image of a Celtic child. Children didn't go to school and probably had to help their parents as soon as they could be useful and were old enough. Family pets. This bronze model of a dog was found in England. Many little models of dogs have been found. It's likely that dogs were kept as family pets as well as being working dogs. Women's work. Celtic women prepared all the food for their families. Another task was making woolen cloth. After the sheep had been clipped, the knots were combed out of the fleece with combs like these. Made from bone. The fleece was then spun into yarn on a spindle. Wool combs have been found on many Celtic sites. Did the Celts live in houses? No complete houses from Celtic times still exist, but archaeologists have found enough remains to know what Celtic houses looked like. They know that many of the houses were round, and walls were usually built of stone. The roofs were thatched with straw or reeds. Duncarloway Broch. Some of the Celts in Scotland lived in stone towers called brochs. These were round and had a double wall with a stone staircase running up inside it. The house at Little Buster. This is a reconstruction of a Celtic house. Its framework is made from tree trunks. The roof is thatched with straw. The walls are made from a mixture of twigs and mud called wattle and daub. The way into the house is through a wooden door. Inside a Celtic house. As this photograph shows, a Celtic house had just one big room. The fire burning in the middle gave heat and light. It was also used for cooking. There was no chimney, and sparks from the fire could set the thatched roof on fire. Archaeologists have found the remains of very little Celtic furniture. At night, people slept on the floor, wrapped up in the skins of bears and wolves to keep warm. The Celts cooked over an open fire. They used pans with round bottoms like this cauldron. The Celts sat on the floor to eat. Food was served in dishes made of wood, pottery. There were knives but not forks. Some food would be eaten using fingers. Wine and beer would be drunk with the meal. Who went to work in Celtic lands? Most Celts worked for themselves on their own farms. Women and children helped with the work. Some Celts probably had slaves to help them, as slave chains have been found. Metalworkers and smiths made the things people couldn't make themselves. These included tools, weapons, and jewellery. This reconstruction shows a Celtic smith's forge. The smith heated a bar of iron in the fire until it was red hot. Then he put it on the anvil to hammer it into shape he wanted. Mining salt. At Halstatt, salt miners dug into the mountainside and then dug tunnels into the salt with picks. Torches like these helped them to see in places where there was no daylight. Glass workers. Glass workers could only make a small amount of glass at a time. It was used for beads, bracelets, and ornaments like this little dog. Iron chains. This Celtic chain has 6 collars. It may have tied up a group of slaves. Bronze workers. Buckets and bowls were usually made of wood. For special occasions, the wood was covered with thin sheets of bronze. The handle was also made of bronze. We think slaves were important to the Celts in 2 different ways. Firstly, they helped with work around the farm. Secondly, the Celts could exchange slaves for other goods that they wanted. This slave trade was very important as the Roman Empire grew. The Romans used slave labour to run the mines and farms that supported the empire. Some of these slaves were Celts who had been defeated by Romans. Others had been sold into slavery. They were often exchanged for wine. What did the Celts wear? Celtic clothes needed to be hard-wearing. Men wore woolen trousers and a sleeveless shirt done up with brooches. In winter, men wore a cloak, while women wore a long-skirted gown and a shawl. The Celts liked bright colours and material patterned with squares and stripes. Brooches. Celtic men and women used brooches to do up their clothes. The most common brooches were called fibulae. As you can see in this photograph, they did up like a safety pin. Fibulae worn every day were made from bronze. Special fibulae were made from gold and decorated with enamel. Jewellery. Many Celtic women wore glass beads around their necks. Often the beads were plain, but blue beads with a white pattern were also very popular. Finger and toe rings and bronze and gold bracelets were worn by some women. Footwear. This workman's shoe was found in the salt mines at Halstatt. The salt stopped the leather from rotting away. Most Celts probably wore shoes like these, but some shoes trimmed with gold have also been found. Making clothes. The woman below probably made all the clothes that her family needed. First she spun wool into yarn, then she coloured the yarn with vegetable dyes. She could then weave it into patterned cloth on a loom. She cut the clothes from the cloth and sewed them together with a needle made from bone. A bronze belt. Celtic women usually wore long, loose gowns. They used cloth or leather belts to pull their gowns in at the waist. Only wealthy women had belts made from bronze, like this one from Sweden. Cloth soon rots in the ground. This is why no complete pieces of Celtic clothing have ever been found. Brooches have been found with bits of dull brown cloth still pinned to them. When archaeologists study the cloth, they can find out what dyes were used to colour the yarn. The dyes came from plants like woad, madder and weld. These made the colours blue, red and yellow. What did the Celts do in their spare time? Celtic farmers had to look after their crops and animals all year round, but they still found time to enjoy sports and games. They also celebrated religious festivals each year. Two of these were Samhain on the 1st of November and Beltane on the 1st of May. Celebrations included feasting, drinking and music. Celtic feasts. There was lots of drinking at Celtic feasts. Most people drank beer, which they made from barley. Wealthy Celts probably drank wine. The wine was served in bowls like this silver cauldron from Denmark. The Celts ate plenty of pork and venison at their feasts. The meat was roasted on a spit over the fire. When it was cooked, it was divided up so that the most important people got to eat the best bits. Playing pieces have been found in Celtic sites and graves. The pieces in this photograph are part of a set of 24. They're made of glass and can be divided by colour into 4 groups. Music and dancing. There are written descriptions of the Celts enjoying music and dancing, but only a few musical instruments have ever been found. A carnix and trumpet. Samhain and Halloween. Samhain was the name of the Celtic New Year. It was celebrated on the 1st of November, which was the start of winter. The farm animals were brought together. Some were kept and some were killed for food. Samhain was thought to be a time of magic. People were able to pass into the world of spirits and then return. The memory of some of this magic is now celebrated on the 31st of October as Halloween. Horses were a means of transport, but it is likely the Celts also rode for pleasure. This pony cap was found in Scotland. The holes are for the pony's ears to stick out of. The horns were added to the cap later. How did the Celts travel? The earliest Celts travelled on foot through the high mountain passes in the Alps. They carried everything they needed on their backs. On flatter ground they travelled on horseback or in chariots and wagons. Many Celts lived by water, so they travelled in boats. Some Celts crossed the sea in small ships to trade with nearby countries. A 4-wheeled wagon. Celtic wagons and chariots were made mostly from wood, because wood rots. No complete ones have survived. But archaeologists have found enough metal fittings and marks left in the soil to make the model wagon shown in this photograph. 2 horses pulled this wagon. They were fastened to a wooden yoke at the end of the pole in the centre. Boats. This model of a boat was found in Ireland. It's made from gold. It has oars for rowing and a mast for sailing. Pictures on coins. We know a lot about the Celts, horses and chariots from the pictures on coins. This one is from the 1st century AD. Coracles. When the Celts were travelling a short distance on water, they often used a coracle. This was a small boat made from a light wickerwork frame. Waterproofed animal skins were stretched over the frame. A coracle was round in shape and was paddled with a single oar. What happened to the Celts? As the Roman Empire increased, it took over most of the Celts' lands. The Celts began to live like the Romans. Some tribes accepted the Romans, wanting to add Britain to their empire, but others would not. In Scotland, Ireland, most of Wales and Cornwall, the Celts managed to carry on living their lives as they had before. Hadrian's Wall. The Romans didn't conquer Scotland. They built Hadrian's Wall to protect the northern border of Britain. It was started in AD 122 and was 120 kilometres long. After the Romans. The Roman soldiers left Britain at the start of the 5th century AD. Angles, Jutes and Saxons soon invaded Britain from the east. They settled in the areas which had been ruled by the Romans. The Celts stayed in Scotland, Wales and the southeast. They were joined by more Celts from Ireland. Irish settlement, Angles, Jutes and Saxons, Irish advance, Anglian advance. Irish settlement, Angles, Jutes and Saxons, Irish advance, Anglian advance. The Celtic inheritance. Many old Celtic tribes are remembered in place names. The Parisii gave their name to Paris. The Belgii gave their name to Belgium. Celtic languages are still used by people who speak Welsh, Gaelic, Ursa, Manx, Cornish and Breton. King Arthur's Round Table. In the Great Hall of the castle in Winchester is what is thought to be the Round Table. This is where King Arthur sat with his knights. Late Celtic jewellery. Celtic jewellery designs were copied for centuries. Brooches like this one were used to do up cloaks. Queen Victoria wore this style in the 19th century. Celtic Christianity. After the Romans left Britain, Christianity died out in most places, but it continued to grow in Ireland. Monks built monasteries like this one at Ardmore. Many years later, monks from Ireland took Christianity back to Britain. And this is where I'll end the video. I hope you enjoyed watching, and if you did, please join me again soon for another one. Bye.